Okay, so now we're going to talk about the origin of species and how species actually occur and how they actually separate from one another. So, as previously stated, a species is a group of organisms whose member can breed and produce fertile offspring, and speciation is simply the emergence of a new species. Okay, so speciation is splitting of one species into two or more, and then that transformation of one species into a new species over time. So it's either I take, like humans and chimpanzees had a common ancestor and then it sort of split, or I have one species that eventually evolves into a new species, but that means that the old species is no longer there anymore. The final result of the change of the gene pool, this is the final result of changes in the gene pool, allele and genotypic frequencies. The focal point of evolution is to serve a link between micro and macroevolution. So we talked previously, microevolution is a change in allele frequencies within a population, whereas macroevolution is you're looking at a broad pattern of evolutionary change over much, much longer periods of time. The concept of having a species and what exactly defined a species has really been a major hurdle for biologists over the years. So Linnaeus is who came up with the binomial naming of organisms, your genus and species. Linnaeus's system was based on taxonomy, is rather the basis of taxonomy, which is naming and classifying diverse life forms. Limitations of a taxonomy: similarities between some species and variations within a species can make defining a species difficult. That little bird up there, it is actually two different species of birds, and yet they are markedly similar, to the point that one could even potentially mistake one for the male and one for the female of one species. And then we look at humans or dogs, for example, and you have huge variations. And does that does that allow it to be a species? So the biological concept of a species is that members can interbreed and produce fertile offspring, reproductively isolated by various factors preventing mixing with other species, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. But the big thing is interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Okay. There are other definitions. The morphological species concept was simply based on morphology. And truthfully, like birds, a lot was done with birds and morphologically. What are the slight differences in wings? What are the slight differences in beaks, etc.? Ecological species concept is based on a niche: your predator versus your prey, your herbivore versus your carnivore versus your omnivore. And phylogenetic is the smallest grouping of organisms that share a common ancestor. So your primates, for example, versus your felines. Okay. Maintaining species isolation is important. Okay. And so we have reproductive barriers that are categorized as both prezygotic and postzygotic. Prezygotic meaning it is before fertilization occurs, and postzygotic meaning after fertilization occurs. So habitat isolation. While species live in the same general area, they don't actually live in the same place. For example, you could have a monkey species, two monkey species, where one sort of lives up in the canopy of the trees and the other lives closer to the ground, and therefore they don't inhabit the same space. Behavioral isolation: your special signals that are recognized, the lovely mating dance of the blue-footed booby, or the bird of paradise. Okay, other organisms just look at it and think, man, that's really creepy. However, members of their own species find it unarguably attractive. Temporal isolation: breeding occurs at different times. Skunks, for example, you might have one species of skunk that mates in the fall where the other species mates in the spring. If your estrus doesn't line up, then you're not going to have mating. Mechanical isolation: so basically, things don't line up. Okay, you're anatomically incompatible. Or gametic isolation: so maybe the whole mechanical aspect of mating can occur, but the gametes simply don't recognize one another. Okay, so our skunks here are an example of two species that simply breed at different times. One breeds in the fall, the other breeds in the spring. Our behavioral isolation, as previously mentioned, our fabulous blue-footed booby. Okay, mechanical isolation. This is actually in the case we're looking at the flower more than we are the hummingbird, that the male and female sex organs or gametes are not actually compatible with one another. Then we have post-zygotic hybridization, or I'm sorry, post-zygotic barriers. So we have reduced hybrid viability, which simply means that even though you have two different species that mate with one another, the embryo aborts. Uh, you can have reduced hybrid fertility, which means that you actually do get offspring from it, but that offspring is actually sterile, or you can get hybrid breakdown. So the hybrids can actually mate, but then the copy of the copy is a problem. Okay. So hybrid sterility, mules. Okay, you made a horse and a donkey, you get a mule. Mules are not capable of mating. This is one of the reasons that they're great as pack animals. They don't get Twitter pated. Okay, well, if you want to go to that, I'll put that link in there somewhere in the video. And I'm actually going to stop here and then we'll create a new video in a minute.